Alright, gang. I'm really sorry I'm not there, but let's try and get this Nicaraguan PowerPoint finished once and for all. So we're at slide 9, which I think I had started to talk about, but let's flesh it out. So this slide is about the Sandinistas and Carter. And if you recall, President Carter is in a bit of a dilemma here because while he helped negotiate Somoza stepping down and resigning, he also is not a big fan of the Sandinistas. And later on, Carter's actually going to be blamed for losing Nicaragua to socialism. So that's the dilemma. Now, again, ultimately, as I just mentioned, Somoza does resign. He first goes to Florida, and then he heads off to Paraguay, where he lives in exile. And just as kind of a footnote, the Sandinistas form a coalition government, and when they do take control of the government, the Sandinistas actually send a team of hitmen to Paraguay, and they shadow the movements of Somoza for months. And then ultimately, one day while Somoza is driving down the street, they shoot his armor-plated car with a bazooka and officially assassinates Somoza. So getting back to Nicaragua itself, again, there's a coalition government is formed. Carter insists that there are representatives from the National Guard in this government, and as you can imagine, the Sandinistas are not very thrilled about that. But ultimately, the Sandinistas take control of the government, and they start to institute true land reform. They do get tired of Carter's meddling in Nicaragua and his kind of waffling. And to try to secure U.S. influence, Carter starts to cut back on aid to Nicaragua. And then, of course, this causes the relationship to disintegrate between the Sandinistas and Carter. And, of course, the Soviet Union steps in, and they volunteer to give Nicaragua some financial aid, and later on some military aid. And meanwhile, in neighboring El Salvador, there's a kind of a guerrilla affair going on there against a military-dominated dictatorship as well. And the Sandinistas, they provide some military aid to the rebels in El Salvador, and this, of course, draws the anger of the United States and charges that Nicaragua is trying to spread Soviet communism. Alright, so this brings us to the next slide. This is number 10, the pivotal years of 1979 and 1980. And unfortunately for Nicaragua, it does get caught up in other big affairs around the world. Most notably, we start in Iran, and there's a revolution against the dictatorship that the U.S., surprise, surprise, had actually supported in Iran, and this support had gone back to the early 1950s and the first successful CIA operation to remove a foreign leader, and the Prime Minister Mossadegh was taken out of Iran, and we'll talk more about this later, and a pro-U.S. dictatorship was put into place, a guy named the Shah, S-H-A-H, and of course the United States trains the security apparatus of the Shah to crush any and all dissent. But again, more on that later. So we have this counter-revolution that happens in 1979, and the dictator that the U.S. had supported for decades is ousted, and the U.S. embassy is taken over by quote-unquote Islamic fundamentalists, and these are largely college students, and of course they want to decrease U.S. influence in Iran and in the entire Middle East. And some of you may have seen the film Argo, which includes part of this saga. We'll watch this movie in a week or so. So get those permission slips signed ASAP. Alright, so in addition to this action happening in Iran, we also have a big incident that crops up in Afghanistan. And the Soviet Union, uh, which at this time shared a border with both Iran and Afghanistan, invades Afghanistan to try to help a weak communist government that had taken over in Afghanistan. Sorry about that. That had taken over in Afghanistan, and in response, the United States helps to organize and train the Mujahideen, which is a series, rather a group of quote unquote holy warriors. And again, the CIA is involved in arming them and training them. And then later on, members of this Mujahideen go on to form the Taliban. And in what later is going to become super ironic, some guy by the name of Osama bin Laden is also raising money and providing weapons for the Mujahideen. So, believe it or not, the United States and Osama bin Laden were temporarily on the same side in trying to get the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. And obviously, we'll explore this in more detail when we get into our Middle Eastern unit. So, as if the Iranian revolt and this invasion of Afghanistan wasn't enough, we have a third big event that starts in 1980, and that's when Iran and Iraq engage in war with one another. And this war initially started off as a border dispute between Iran and Iraq, and once again, the United States finds itself in a tough position here because we don't like either the Iranians or the Iraqis. We don't like the Iranians because they overthrew the government of the Shah, who we'd been supporting. And Iraq at this time is run by Saddam Hussein, who, of course, has a terrible track record against human rights. But the United States, believe it or not, had supported Iraq as well because of our hatred for Iran. And during the Iran-Iraq War, which lasts for about 8 years, the United States actually spends time supporting both Iran and Iraq with weapons. This is again when the Iran-Contra affair business were secretly giving the Iranians weapons, and the United States also gave Iraq aid, and mainly in the form of military intelligence. And there were definitely some people in the United States who thought, oh, gee whiz, this is a terrible thing that Iran and Iraq are fighting each other because we hate both of them. But, of course, we want the oil, and we want also to protect our ally, Israel. And Iran and Iraq both hate Israel. Now, of course, from Carter's perspective, we're now creeping up on the 1980 election, and this is going to force Carter to change his U.S. foreign policy. Now, if you recall me mentioning earlier, when Carter was elected, one of his big objectives was to improve the treatment of human rights and to be less of a cold warrior. But these events are going to force him to abandon this desire to help human rights, and it's going to force him to try to be a tough cold warrior and to show the rest of the world that he cannot be pushed around. So Carter is going to take a hard line in Nicaragua, and he's going to cut off all military aid. Now the Sandinistas are naturally fearful of U.S. intervention, and so they start to purchase weapons from the Soviet Union and Cuba. And in the United States, this is viewed as a clear-cut case of communist, as in Soviet communism, domination in Nicaragua, and that's not going to be tolerated in the Western Hemisphere. Oh no. Alright, so now let's go on to the next slide. This is Reagan and the Contras. Reagan ultimately destroys Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election. Again, this happens in November of 1980. Reagan is successful at making Carter look weak on communism, and that all of his foreign policy was a big failure, and that Reagan is going to right the ship and make America strong again. And one thing that was greatly in Reagan's favor was that he's able to secure the release of the hostages in Iran shortly after his election. And I always remember this as a kid. I was 8, and everybody had ribbons in their yards and candles in their windows to symbolize the captivity of these hostages, which was a grand total of 444 days. And when Reagan was able to get their release, obviously everybody viewed him as a huge hero. Now, moving back to Nicaragua, Reagan again is a staunch Cold Warrior. He's terrified of Cuban influence in Nicaragua or of Soviet influence in Nicaragua, and so he's going to make it a priority of his administration to get the Sandinistas out of control of Nicaragua. As you can see, the slide has the second bullet there, fear of another Cuba, and this was the constant cry in the Reagan administration of the fear of communism spreading into Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, you name it. So under Reagan's instructions, the United States really starts to help the Contras come into being, and lots of military training is arranged for the Contras. And again, a lot of this training happens in Panama, where a U.S. sympathetic dictator named Noriega is in control. The CIA is going to provide lots of financial assistance for the Contras and all anti-Sandinista groups. And Reagan believed that Nicaragua was, quote, an extraordinary threat, unquote, to the national security of the United States. And he went so far as to compare the Contra struggle against the Sandinistas to the American Revolution. So obviously Reagan is a huge supporter of the Contras, and he really believes that they're the ticket to making Nicaragua safe. Surprise, surprise, many members of the Contras were former members of the National Guard, who the U.S. had trained often via the School of Americas, and they again engaged in a lot of human rights abuses when they were under Somoza's control. And Reagan referred to the Contras as freedom fighters. And this is really important because it's this classic idea of one person's freedom fighters or another person's terrorists. It totally depends on one's perspective. But again, the U.S. is anti-Sandinista, so to them the Contras are freedom fighters, and to the Sandinistas, the Contras are terrorists. And here we really see the influence of Vietnam, that the United States is not going to send in the Marines if they can help it. Because again, they're afraid of getting pulled into a long-lasting guerrilla war. So instead, we need to train local people to engage in these struggles. And here's where the Contras come in very handy. And the Contras are going to try to destroy the economy under the Sandinistas to try to help inspire revolt. So they attack infrastructure. So we're talking about things like bridges. If you do recall, back when you were first given the foldable assignments, I included one page from a manual on how to cause problems to the economy. That was from a manual prepared by the CIA on how to disrupt the economy. Now, speaking of the CIA, the next bullet there you'll see is a guy named Dewey Claridge, and he is a classic agent of the CIA. You'll see him in a video later, and he helps to plan Contra attacks in Nicaragua. And one of the more famous, or becomes an infamous attack, deals with the mining of a harbor in Nicaragua. And the idea was that when ships came in from overseas, they would be sunk, and then they wouldn't want to trade with Nicaragua anymore. Now, the Contras also engage in random acts of violence, and ultimately they're responsible for the death of 30,000 people. So I'm sorry, I realized I just forgot to speak about the fourth bullet down, that in 1984, the Sandinistas did schedule presidential elections, and there were observers from all over the world, including from the United States, and they judged that Ortega had won the 1944 presidential election fair and square. But of course, this did not sit well with the Reagan administration, and they're going to do what they can to push the Sandinistas out of power, even if that means using dictators like Noriega in Panama to help them achieve their goals. Alright, so moving on to the next slide, you can see here, well, you can sort of see here, it's a declassified document, and this document was declassified courtesy of the National Security Archive, which I think I told some of you to use in your historiographies. They're great at getting these documents open to the public. And you can see here that this is a a memo from McFarlane from Oliver North, who you've probably heard something about before in the readings you've done. If not, you will shortly today. And if you see, the subject says special activities in Nicaragua, and it talks in the very beginning there, on the night of February 29th, that somebody, which is probably Claridge and the Contras, placed 4 magnetic mines in the harbor at Corentino, Nicaragua. And again, the idea here was to try to make things rough for the Nicaraguan economy. And then if you look underneath that big piece that's blocked out, it says, "Our intention is to severely disrupt the flow of shipping essential to Nicaraguan trade during the peak export period." And the last part of the document that I want to call your attention to, if you look towards the bottom under the last big crossed out part, it says, "While we could probably find a way to overtly stop the tanker from loading/departing, it is our judgment that destroying the vessel and its cargo will be far more effective in accomplishing our overall goal." And I just think that's important to note that here they did believe there was a way they could solve this peacefully, but they opted for a more violent option. But again, we're talking about the CIA. This isn't the Culinary Institute of America. It's a Central Intelligence Agency. All right, so looking at the next slide, this one is called the Iran-Contra Connection. And we start off with the Boland Amendments. And there were a couple amendments made to the Boland Amendment, but the first one is passed in 1982, and this was an attempt by Congress to stop the funding of the Contras. And the Boland Amendment, again, it called for a stop to all military and non-military aid, and this is going to lead to one of the biggest scandals that almost nobody knows about these days, the Iran-Contra affair. Now, we now know, because of documents being declassified, that Reagan had told the National Security Council to keep the Contras alive, quote, body and soul. And in order to get money to fund the Contras on the DL was going to be by selling weapons to Iran. And you can see in that picture there that that's a picture of something called a TOW missile, which stands for a tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided missile. And I actually have a video of this in action, which I'll try to insert here. But if it doesn't work, just go to good old YouTube and Google TOW missile. Not now, but later. Then if we move on to the next bullet, there's a second hostage crisis that occurs in the Middle East. And this time, we're talking about in Beirut, Lebanon, in 1985. And 6 U.S. citizens were taken hostage by an extremist Shiite Muslim terrorist group. And the hope here was that if the U.S. could covertly, again, emphasis covertly, sell weapons to Iran, that the Iranians could put pressure on this group in Lebanon to release these hostages. And now I have to share a very important quote from Reagan, which he stated on the news about terrorism. And he says, quote, "Let me further make it plain to the assassins in Beirut and their accomplices, wherever they may be, that America will never make concessions to terrorists. To do so would only invite more terrorism. Nor will we ask nor pressure any other government to do so. Once we head down that path, there'd be no end to it, no end to the suffering of innocent people, no end to the bloody ransom all civilized nations must pay even." End quote. And again, this, as you can imagine, the public, many people like this strong approach against terrorism, but unfortunately, Reagan is going to go completely against this quote by trying to, again, sell these missiles to the Iranians, for one, to curry their favor, and for two, to then use the funds from those weapon sales to aid the Contras in Nicaragua, and he's also going to use Israel, of all nations, as a middleman. So unfortunately, this quote is balderdash. Now again, I have another link. That picture of Reagan is a link to a speech of him lying to the public. So if you want to know what it looks like to see a president lie, again, I will try to insert that video, but if not, you'll have to grab the link either off the link on the Moodle or straight from YouTube. Okay, on to the next slide. All right, so you can see that this is another declassified document. Again, this is courtesy even of the National Security Archive. And my favorite part, if you note at the very top, in all caps and underlined, it says, "Please destroy after reading." And obviously, someone didn't get the message, and lucky for us historians and citizens of the public who want to know what our government does, we have access to at least part of the document. And this, again, is kind of part of a journal where you can see the CIA moving weapons around. So again, they're on January 18th. It says CIA transfers $6 million to DOD. That's, again, the Department of Defense, account by wire services. Then the next line, again, CIA orders movement of 1,000 TOW missiles. And again, the TOW stands for that tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided missile. They're moving 1,000 of these missiles from Alabama to blank. And that blank is probably Israel, because again, Israel was the middleman here. And then if you look down at February 2nd, it says, COP travels to Israel for a site survey of transfer points. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And I did read one kind of funny anecdote that when the Iranians first got these missiles, they were really angry because the crates had Hebrew on them, because basically the Israelis sold their old missiles to Iran and then replaced those weapons with ones from the US. And apparently they were just furious that Hebrew, the language the Jewish people speak, was on these missiles, because again, the Iranians hate Israel. And so later on, the CIA would go ahead and paint over the Hebrew on the missile crates. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And you can see here we have another declassified document here. And this one, I believe, if my research is correct, is actually from an email that the members in the White House had tried to delete. But when this investigation of the Contra affair began, they were able to retrieve this email from the computer. And as you can see at the top there, it says the residual funds from this transaction are allocated as follows. And these are, again, funds from missile sales. And it says $2 million will be used to purchase replacement TOWs. Again, those typically launched optically tracked wire-guided missiles. For the original 508 sold by Israel. So we can see here again, Israel and the middleman. Missiles, again, sold by Israel to Iran. And technically, this was against U.S. law to sell weapons to Iran because there were lots of embargoes placed on Iran when they overthrew the government and occupied our embassy. And then if you look at that second dash there, it says $12 million will be used to purchase critically needed supplies for the Nicaraguan Democratic Resistance Forces. And that was kind of the politically correct name for the Contras. And it goes on to say, this material is essential to cover shortages in resistance inventories resulting from their current offensives and Sandinista counterattacks, and to bridge the period between now and when congressionally approved lethal assistance, beyond $25 million and defensive arms can be delivered. And the last part that I want to call your attention to is if you look towards the very bottom of the document when it says, quote, our emphasis on the Soviet military and subversive threat. And just again, this notion that from the Reagan administration's point of view, this is the actions of Soviet communism in Nicaragua. And it's again sort of implying that the people themselves in Nicaragua have no interest in socialism and that they're being pawns of the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, the evidence seems to bear that the opposite was true. That again, this is a country that historically had gigantic gaps between social classes, and the majority of people were quite poor, and they were okay with some type of socialism in place. And one could fairly make the charge again that the United States did not know the people or the conditions well enough, similar to Vietnam, because unfortunately the only other conclusion one could draw is that they just were not concerned. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so with this slide, as you can see, the title is Iran-Contra Scandal. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the scandal. And again, up the top right there, that's good old Oliver North, who's a key figure in the Iran-Contra affair. And I'll never forget, back when the scandal broke, that lots of bumper stickers started coming out that would say, "You can't spell Ollie without the lie." All right, well, let's get back to the slide here. So how did people find out about the Iran-Contra scandal? Well, it begins with a plane being shot down that was piloted by Eugene Hassenfuss, and he's apprehended by the Sandinistas, and he pretty much right away says, "Don't hurt me, I work for the US government." And he quickly admits that he was flying supplies to the Contras. And then meanwhile, initially a Lebanese newspaper breaks the story that the United States was selling weapons to Iran through Israel. And between the capture of Hassenfuss, who, again, this was actually aired on CNN, his capture by the Sandinistas, and when the news from this Lebanese paper makes it over to the United States, Congress starts an independent investigation to find out what in the world is going on here. And again, what's important to note is that when the scandal first broke, Reagan completely denied it. And he said that the United States would never, ever deal arms for hostages. And then about a week later, he recants. And again, it's very clear that he had lied to try to protect the Contras and to protect the reputation of the United States. Be that as it may, Congress appoints an independent counsel led by a man named Lawrence Walsh to investigate, and these hearings were broadcast on the news. I remember, again, at this point, I was, I think, around 13 years old, and I could not have cared less about the Iran-Contra affair, but I remember my parents were always watching the hearings on TV, and I thought it was terribly boring. But of course, now I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I wished I had paid more attention. But regardless, there, looking back again at the slide, that is Oliver North testifying or swearing in to testify before Congress, and beneath him, the blonde lady was his secretary, named Fawn Hall. Now, and we would learn a lot about the scandal from Fawn Hall's testimony, because in exchange, of course, for immunity, she spilled the beans, and apparently she was known to take classified documents and stuff them in her boots and stuff them in her undergarments to sneak them out of the office to shred them off-site. Now, again, one of the big controversies in the Iran-Contra scandal deals with this issue about what did Reagan know. And of course, Reagan denied knowing anything and said that these were rogue agencies operating without his knowledge, but a lot of evidence has been compiled to the contrary. And let me give you a few examples of that evidence. For one, apparently the Secretary of Defense, he took extensive notes during the meetings about aiding the Contras, and those notes were obtained by Walsh and the independent counsel. Reagan did sign what was known as a presidential finding, and this paperwork is necessary to kind of greenlight the CIA. It's part of the oversight process, and in this presidential finding that he signed, it did have statements about exchanging arms for hostages. According from the report itself from Walsh, he wrote, quote, Reagan was informed and personally approved of both February shipments, once again, of those TOW missiles, end quote. Oliver North, again, pictured there in a big expose in Time magazine. He said that Reagan knew everything. And then last but not least, again, this is from the Iran-Contra scandal declassified history put together by the National Security Archive. They got a hold of Reagan's diary, and apparently he wrote, quote, I agreed to sell TOWs to Iran. Now, one thing that became very problematic is that by the time Reagan was interviewed about the Iran-Contra in detail, he claimed that he didn't remember. And Reagan did ultimately end up suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and there's lots of debate about when these effects started to influence him, and even his family disagreed. Some claimed it actually started while he was still in office, while others said it was after he was president. Now, also, the picture of North is a link to an excellent segment from American Dad, in which they do a little Schoolhouse Rock style parody of this affair, and hopefully, again, I can stick it in to this presentation. If not, you'll have to look at it on YouTube. But in essence, many of the documents and emails that the government tried to shred were recovered, so we could connect the dots and understand that, again, the government illegally sold weapons to Iran through Israel. They marked up the price of those missiles, and then they used the profits to illegally provide money for the Contras to try to defeat the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. All right, let's move on to the final slide. And you can see here we're talking about the significance of the Iran-Contra affair, and we've got this host of questions. And once again, very similar to other incidents in the Cold War. We have to ask, can we trust our government? And again, we've talked about this a bit before, and I wish I had a good answer here, but it's obviously going to be very difficult for us to trust our government. The second piece there is what happens when our leaders lie, and oftentimes, well, nothing happens to them, and maybe that needs to change. Another very important question that we have to ask ourselves is, what policies are we prepared to support to achieve our goals? In other words, whether we're fighting communism or fighting terrorism, what are we willing to do to achieve those goals? Are we willing to violate human rights? Are we willing to engage in torture? Are we willing to form alliances with unsavory characters? These are very hard choices that we have to make. Also important to note who's watching the government, and in theory this is supposed to be the media. This is why freedom of the press is located in the First Amendment. Our founding fathers wanted the press to sort of be a fourth branch of government to report to the citizens about what our government was doing in our name. And then last but definitely not least, we have to ask, how does the Iran-Contra affair impact democracy? Because clearly the actions that were taken in Nicaragua, well, it's kind of hard to say that they were pro-democratic actions. And you're going to see this some more when you read next about the Nicaraguan presidential elections in 1990 and how the U.S. went about influencing those elections. All right, well, that finally wraps up this PowerPoint. I'm sorry this was kind of strange. Hopefully it wasn't too terribly boring. If you have questions, again, please email me. And I hope to see you guys soon. All right, take care.